Good day, denizens. Welcome back to yet another series of Powercasts. We delve into the Industrial Revolution following the other revolutions we've been talking about that were more warlike in their nature, and the French Revolution, which was also just crazy-like. But another revolution was also going on at the same time, an Industrial Revolution, where essentially humankind, is moving from using animals and human physical labor to create things and build things to using machines and also nature as well. And you can see this beautiful, beautiful picture here that really lifts your spirits looking up here. It's just being sarcastic, but nonetheless, we'll talk about this. But let's game on here. Okay, so basically, the revolutions themselves, American, French, and Latin American revolutions, mercantilism is going to die with those. Bye-bye mercantilism, adios, sayonara, you are gone. And basically, this is going to lead us into this new economic transformation that is the Industrial Revolution. And it's an economic transformation because basically we're moving out of this idea that all resources go to a king or to the government, but instead resources are turned into products which are sold on global markets, and typically to earn profit for entrepreneurs and businesses. We're going to see some people grow very, 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 very rich off of the Industrial Revolution with the inventions that they create. And basically, by 1850, by the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, we're going to see people in Western Europe and North America, this kind of Atlantic Ocean arc, if you can visualize that, basically are the wealthiest and healthiest peoples on the planet, certainly more so than anyone else on Earth. And the country that's really going to pave the way in all of this are the British. Britain is going to use, this economic power that they're going to gain, this industrial power they're going to gain, to increase their political and economic control around the world. As a matter of fact, they will pretty much, own the planet as we roll into the 19th century or through the 19th century. And basically what's going on, European nations are becoming more powerful because they're exporting more than they're importing. They have what you call a favorable balance of trade. When you sell more than you have to buy, you tend to make this thing called profit. Now, I'm no economist, but I'm pretty sure that that's the right thing to do if you want to become wealthy. And we always talk about the Europeans, Western Europe as industrializing, but what the heck was China doing? Well, China had some issues politically. They certainly had the know-how to industrialize easily. I mean, China, up to this point, is the preeminent world power, right? As we talked about all year, but there are some issues. China, they had science, but their government didn't really fund experimentation. Britain, they'll do that. The government pours all kinds of money into experiments, paying scientists, things like this, and encouraging them to explore. But basically, because science doesn't, or because China doesn't link, this kind of impetus to create new things and to fund thinkers and inventors, China's going to fall behind. But there are other reasons too. With the Qing dynasty, which will be the last dynasty in China, remember these are the Manchus. All the great minds in China are basically absorbed by the great bureaucracy. These are the people who are passing the civil service exam and going straight into the government, and their biggest issues, or biggest concerns I should say, are tax collection and playing favorites in the government with a little bit of corruption on the side. And basically, because of this, the way you collect taxes in China at this time is through agriculture. So basically, they're reinforcing an old agrarian system, agrarian as in agriculture, as in farming. And basically, they're still in this kind of agrarian system while Western Europe and northern North America is moving toward industrialization. So while now, of course, you look at the south of North America or southern United States, they're very similar to China in this way in that they're still practicing farming as opposed to industrialization. So we do have kind of a commonality there. And of course, the Chinese, they're xenophobic, as we've talked about, their government very xenophobic at this time, as we've talked about throughout the course of the year as well. So they're not worried with expansion. They're not, taking over colonies and imperializing. And of course, the main thing that you needed to really show that you were industrializing, the most important machine, is the steam engine. And hey, the Chinese had the steam engine. But the problem is that they didn't really see any practical use for the steam engine other than just as a novelty, as kind of a toy for the most part. The Europeans used their steam engines. What necessitated it, what caused it to be necessary, was because European mines fill with water once they dig too deep. So they needed some type of machine, attached to buckets to pull out the water. Problem is, Chinese mines are dry. So they never really saw this practical use for the steam engine. But for the Europeans, they figured that if they can use that machine to drive a line of buckets, on some type of elliptical path, well, then you could also use it to spin a wheel on a platform that we'll call a train, or a wheel on a floating platform that we'll call a steamship. But nonetheless, Britain leads the way. The British, because they lead the way with industrialization, it's going to allow them basically to take over the planet as we roll into, or as we roll through the 19th century. But why? Why the British? Why? Well, first of all, they have lots of coal and coal and iron are the essential elements for the first industrial revolution. You got no coal, you got no iron, you got no revolution, and there you are. Sorry, 80s flashback. But nonetheless, they also have a lot of technological innovations, right? The British have the steam engine, but also a lot of other, smaller innovations too, like power looms and things like this, spinning jennies. Because they had this free society that encouraged people to innovate. The banking system, British have one of the best banking systems on the planet. And basically they could mobilize capital as in money. And basically, by being able to mobilize money, people can afford to go into debt. Does that make sense? To try to invent things and take risks, and the British have the banking system for it. The British already had a great internal market. They already had lots of trade going on internally, so if you can do it internally, you can trade externally. And British merchants who had long been traveling around the planet had lots of access to markets all around the planet. Of course, they have the best navy on the planet. They had a huge labor force, did the British, who wanted to work for wages. Right? I mean, and a big reason for this is because of the transformation in farming, which we'll talk about here in a second. British had a great military, great navy. Before the Americas became independent, they could exploit raw materials under mercantilism, right? So they have plenty of access to raw materials. And even when the Americas go away from British rule, they got India to exploit. For a time, they'll have Egypt to exploit, and later on, pretty much all of Africa to exploit. And agricultural production greatly increased too, which means more food. Also means fewer farmers because of the machinery involved. And increasingly, we start to see all these new factories springing up all across Britain. And basically, we start to see what we call the process of urbanization, or this movement from the rural countryside to the big city. The big city. Let it roll, let it ride. I guess that's more like Vegas, but nonetheless, people moving into these urban areas, obviously, because they need to work. And a lot of people are moving out of the rural areas because farm machinery is replacing the need for extra farm hands out there on the farm. So what do? Well, you still got to work because you still got to eat. So you move to the city. And there's a problem too, because if we have a huge pool of wage laborers, who benefits from that? And nonetheless, the transformation is going to spread, and it's going to create a new division of labor around the world. We'll talk about what that means in the class. But nonetheless, basically what we start to see is Britain and other industrial societies too. The Belgians are going to industrialize, eventually the French, Germany, obviously the United States, especially after the Civil War. All these places that industrialize, basically what they start to do is they're making now manufactured goods. We take that for granted today, right? Like for example, myself, I go hunting all the time. It's at a place called Publix or Kroger. Although Kroger, man, sometimes their produce is just rotten, but what are you going to do? Nonetheless, but hunting is, aisles 1 through 15 in the produce section and wherever else, right? Because we have manufactured goods, stuff in boxes, stuff in cans, stuff, in packages that we can just go out and buy. Things weren't like that before the Industrial Revolution, right? But now with the Industrial Revolution, manufacturing goods, you can just go to the store and buy stuff off the shelf. You don't even have to make it yourself. And on top of that, the transformation that's happening to free trade, free labor has become this new economic ideology, right? Free labor as in people actually, reaping the fruits of their labor, not being enslaved, sort of. And here you see one of these so-called factories that spring up. This is a 19th century factory, and this is actually from an English industrialist, a guy named Robert Owen. And Robert Owen actually was a reformer. He actually had much sympathy for the working class because he saw how terrible conditions were in the factories. And he actually tried to create quote-unquote humane factories because he worried about the terrible conditions in most textile mills. That's the other big thing, textiles. The heart of the Industrial Revolution, the most valuable commodity are textiles, i.e. cloth, because people were wearing clothes, among other things. So you use cloth all the time, right? But nonetheless, this guy, Robert Owen, he tried to create, a more orderly work environment. He tried to make sure that the factory was clean. It looks, pretty clean here, especially compared to other factories. They even have lights up on the ceilings. Factory owners loved lights. That means you can work all night. Nonetheless, he even posted up work rules on the walls, so you have some established protocol. And of course, the terrible, terrible issue of child labor during the Industrial Revolution. Robert Owen was a reformer, but he still had children working in his factories. Yeah. On top of that, in these factories with all the textiles, well, textiles are made of cotton, and from where will you procure said cotton? Well, the biggest ones would be the United States, India, and Egypt. That's where Britain especially was getting its cotton supplies. United States cotton was especially cheap. Why? New farming technologies spring up as well. And this is critical to the Industrial Revolution because, even in the 19th century, people still had to eat food. And in the 19th century, it's going to become even more available. And some of the new technological innovations in the agricultural sector are going to have huge benefits for the global economy, but of course not for all people. So basically, some of the new technologies begin to transform agriculture, and we start to see basically more intensive cultivation, in other words, growing of food, and which is going to increase the yield. In other words, the output of food. More food available, more people eating, more people living longer, more people making more people. So you have more people, population grows. But some of the key inventions that come out, one of the first big ones was the horse-drawn seed press from Jethro Tull. One of those bands in the 70s I never really cared for. I think Neil Young was in that. Just can't do the Neil Young voice. Can't accept. Talented artist. Oh wait, but the other Jethro Tull was this inventor from Britain, a blacksmith, an industrialist, who comes out basically with this horse-drawn seed press. Right around the year 1700, which basically made it so that seeds are planted in even rows. They're planted deeper into the soil, so they're more likely to grow. John Deere, all heard of him, green and yellow. not the Packers, but the tractors. But John Deere didn't actually invent the tractor. He invents the steel plow back in 1837 in the US of A. And the steel plow, obviously, you can till up the land much easier with steel than the wood plows that break. Eli Whitney, who's going to come out with the cotton gin in 1794, is going to make it way easier to acquire cotton, because cotton used to be you would have to remove the seeds by hand, which was tedious and time consuming. But with the cotton gin, it's way easier to remove the seeds. But the irony is this: a lot of people think, oh, well, the cotton gin's invented, so the United States turns away from slavery. It's the other way around. The United States becomes, or at least the South becomes, even more reliant upon slavery, because with the cotton gin, that means you can produce more cotton. And there's huge demand for cotton, not only from Britain, but from the northern United States. They're going to have factories to produce textiles as well. So a lot of times, the South is looked down upon for slavery, and rightfully so, but the North is almost just as complicit in slavery because they're not doing anything to stop it, because they're also making money off of it. Other things that come out: steam-driven tractors, basically using the steam engine by the 1830s, 1840s. Another thing that helps with agriculture: the end of the Little Ice Age. You can have longer growing seasons now because it's not as cold. And two, another big one, perhaps even the most important one, was the idea of crop rotation to replenish the soil. Because it used to be what farmers would do is they would leave large tracts of land fallow, empty, not growing any crops, because they understood that the soil needed to be replenished. If you keep growing the same crop on the same tract of soil over and over and over and over again, it eventually wears out the soil and turns it into sand, aka the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, right? However, what they figure out is that if you take all of your land and divide it up and grow different types of crops in different chunks of land, well, certain crops help to replenish the soil, and certain crops require certain nutrients. So in other words, you could grow particular crops in particular places, and rotate them in and out of each field all year long, which is going to mean more food. And basically, we just start to see all these new products coming out, tea and soap, new products as in on a shelf, sitting on a shelf, right, where you can just go and pick it up. You don't have to make it yourself. You just go to the store and buy it, of course, if you have money. Sugar, silver, all these things become these kind of international commercial commodities. In other words, stuff people make money off of selling around the planet. The tin can is going to come out in 1810. This guy, Peter Durant, not to be confused with Duran, but I hear Peter was hungry like the wolf. Wait a second, that's a double entendre, isn't it? But nonetheless, the tin can is going to be invented in 1810, obviously, which can store and preserve food, right? Interestingly, the can opener is not invented till 1858. Yeah, people use their teeth. That's a joke. Actually, you would have to use some type of, like a blade and a hammer, basically, to just pound a hole into the can to get it open. But it was effective, obviously, for preserving food for longer amounts of time. Even by the 1860s, actually because of the American Civil War, they're going to start putting these things on cans, these little keys, and you still see that today, like on sardine cans, this little key that you pop up the key and then pull back and it opens up the top of the can. And in some of these industrial societies, like in Britain, eventually in the northern United States, even if you were quote unquote poor, you could still afford these manufactured products because the prices on the products are low, relatively speaking. Why? And two, merchants, obviously, they're going to reap the greatest rewards, right, from the expansion. They're the ones really making bank off of all of this. But they're also taking the risks, right? I mean, sometimes we bash the wealthy, but look, I mean, you don't have the wealthy, you don't have an industrial revolution, you don't have stuff on the shelves to buy. And it was the wealthy who really took the risks, providing financing for people's inventions and people's factories and people's endeavors, right? So you take a big risk, loaning a bunch of your capital, even if you have a lot of it, to try to start up a business. And obviously accountants, lawyers, all of these folk are going to make lots of money because of all this international trade. And basically, this is allowing for the creation of the bourgeoisie, basically a new class of commercial men and women, i.e. people who are gaining wealth because of this system. We talked about them. But one of the sadder points of the 19th century, and there are many sadly, um, is going to be one of the downsides of this industrialization that happens in Ireland, the great Irish potato famine of the late 1840s. And basically, what had happened by the time we get to the end of the 1840s, you just have hundreds of thousands of Irish men, women, and children dying because of this potato blight. And basically what happened was from 1845 to 1849, there was a famine in Ireland when the potato crop failed. And basically, potatoes typically, you throw a potato down here on the classroom floor, I guarantee in 2 days you're going to have a crop of potatoes. Just kidding, but point being is that they're very, very hardy, right? They're relatively, easy to grow, relatively speaking. Problem is, by the early 1840s, about half the Irish population, especially the rural poor, was depending almost entirely on the potato for nourishment. Now, you might be thinking French fries would be great to eat every day, but check with your doctor. But reliance on only, one or two high-yielding varieties, made this crop very vulnerable to disease, including something we call late blight, caused by a water mold. And in this case, that's what happened. This water mold that I can't pronounce, phyto, blah, blah, basically ruined this crop. And the British government, they provided minimal relief at best to help the starving Irish. They gave some loans and opened some soup kitchens, but very few. And it's very sad how the British handle this or don't handle this Irish potato famine. And the famine was, it's a watershed event in Ireland's history, especially demographically speaking. Because basically, about 1 million people died from starvation, just terrible and famine-related diseases. Perhaps as many as 2 million emigrated, meaning to leave. And the population continued to decline thereafter. And by the time, of independence in 1929, the Irish population was barely half of the 8.5 million it had been before the famine. But many of those Irish folk, of course, come to the United States, accounting for a large portion of our Irish American population. And they're going to face a lot of issues. And we'll talk about why the British were so harsh and how, sadly, unfortunately, the Irish were treated as they migrated. And two, the 19th century is a time of global migrations. More people are on the move than ever before. And that's very important to point out as well. Now, of course, the other big breakthrough with the Industrial Revolution is the choo-choo train. Railroads, you can see them crisscrossing these places by the middle of the 19th century, 1850 or so. And look at Britain. I mean, that's a lot more green than other places that you can see there. You can also see, where you see iron ore and coal. Those things are also, central to the Industrial Revolution. You have to have the iron and the coal. And you can also see the patterns of urbanization, more and more people moving to the cities here in this map. But we're also seeing this great economic reordering in each of these countries, right? The bourgeoisie, this wealthy class, are rising to prominence, right? And they're going to change the balance in society. We're going to see the formal creation, basically, of social classes, right? The wealthy, this middle class that is emerging, and the poor. And, many of these people, money talks, so they're going to take positions of authority and hold the power, right? One such family, for example, are the Rothschilds, which are this Jewish family in Germany who actually get into banking. And they become one of the richest families of all time. And basically, they loan money. They loan money to kings, to governments. So they become very wealthy because of their know-how. Smart. And the bourgeoisie, they invest in trade in various places and begin to pressure governments to protect their trade. So basically, we're seeing this kind of shift, right? It was, okay, all trade's supposed to go back to the government, mercantilism. Now it's, okay, all trade is supposed to, reap benefits for whoever can take advantage of it, this kind of free market. And then those free marketeers, they turn to the government and say, hey, protect our endeavors, protect our investments. And, at the same time, they're calling for free trade, right? And one of the first regions to really, try free trade was Latin America. Problem is, Latin America has no industries because they've been controlled by the Europeans for so long. So, by the early 1800s, even though Latin America's gained independence, they don't really have any infrastructure. But they do have a lot of extremely wealthy families controlling all the money. So basically what the British do is they seize on this opportunity, and they know that they can just get cheap, foodstuffs, staples, products out of Latin America dirt cheap. And obviously this is going to cause much poverty in Latin America because you only have certain, very wealthy families controlling all the wealth. And by the 1840s, the British, they'd gotten rid of a lot of protectionism. In other words, the government, having tariffs and trying to protect domestic industries. We'll talk more about this, more of an economics topic senior year. But nonetheless, they're taking this attitude of, you got to export stuff to make money, and you want to import as little as possible, just the most basic of things. You want to export to make more profit. And it's the steam engine, that is the basis of all of this. If there's no steam engine, there's no real industrial revolution. This guy James Watt up in Scotland, this invention is just critical because steam power, basically it's going to allow for transportation, right? Trains and steamships. They even try to have steam-powered cars. That doesn't go over very well. But on top of that, using steam power to, make more iron, to refine sugar, to create more textiles, right? You can use it to run these machines to make all of these things, which makes all of these things more available. And obviously the first major area we talked about or pointed out is going to be the textile industry. Textiles are the first industrial revolution. And, you can see here in the start of the 19th century into the 18th, the price of cotton declined by 90%, right? Because of the cotton gin and the wide availability of it. So basically, this allowed the U.S. South to become Britain's main supplier of cotton. So it's starting to sound like Britain might be overly reliant upon the U.S. for cotton. But not so. 1848, cotton textiles are 40% of Britain's exports. In other words, they're bringing in the raw cotton, right? And then they're producing it into textiles and selling it. And that is 40% of their economy. It's almost half their economy. And eventually we're going to see manufacturing technology factories begin to spread to obviously other European nations, but also into North America, the United States, the North. And there you see a steam engine driving a train, and I bet those people were pretty darn surprised. And to finish up here you see a cotton textile mill in the 1830s. I don't know, those machines look pretty safe, don't they? You can probably stick your hand in there and fix one of those gears or something like that. Probably be a bad idea. Nonetheless, that's the end of part 1. Thanks for tuning in. We'll get you part 2 soon. Out. Work. We all have to do it. And working was not exactly fun for many of the workers during the Industrial Revolution. Terrible pay, terrible conditions, child labor, women working the same jobs as men in the factories but not being paid the same amount. Things were not pretty. And then, of course, you had to live in the city because you had to be close to your job. No MARTA to get you to your workplace, though trains are going to be around, but not necessarily running into the cities directly until later on in the 19th century. So basically, this Industrial Revolution reorders economically the way people live, the way people interact, where and how people worked who are all caught in the tentacles of this Industrial Revolution. And increasingly, the workers got to live in cities. And you can only imagine what the effect of that will be with the overcrowding, disease, crime. So cities, as I say there, were not healthy places. And, if you had a whole family, husband, wife, 1, 2, 3 kids, whatever, everybody's going to work. Have to. You can't afford to have children unless really they are out there working in the factories too. And real wages, we'll talk about this concept on the morrow, but nonetheless, real wages aren't even going to rise until we get to the middle of the 19th century. And you couldn't be idle. You couldn't sit around doing nothing. You couldn't sit around snack chatting or Facebooking or I don't know, whatever those things are. Got to go to work. Got to go to work. And hours were long. Conditions weren't safe. And we'll check out a couple of those clips you see down there, some Paris sewermen, and also some of the terrible crimes that are going to occur in these cities. But not everybody just sat back and accepted the way things were. I mean, you had employers who were using clocks to impose discipline and measure efficiency, right? So basically your life as a worker has become ordered by a clock, controlled by an employer. And basically, we're going to get a lot of widespread concern from peoples. And some of these peoples who reject these machines are known as the Luddites. The Luddites were especially popular in Britain. And they took on this name after Ned Ludd, who was supposedly this guy who rose up and broke a couple of stocking frames back at the late 18th century. And they broke these because they saw the machines as taking over jobs for people. So in other words, because of the machines, people wouldn't have the opportunity to have a job. And obviously this has some major consequences for today, that a lot of people are very concerned about machines taking over today. And in the midst of all of this industrial revolution, another major social change, arguably the biggest social change, certainly in the 19th century, perhaps in human history, is going to come because of the dude that you see right there, good old Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was an interesting cat. He had traveled out to the Galapagos Islands, and he had a working theory that animals actually adapted to their environment. And his theory flew in the face of the great chain of being, the predominant theory for why life existed on Earth that we talked about a couple weeks ago, I don't know, time flies. And after he goes to the Galapagos, and you can see him there, that's right, he is testing the speed of a tortoise on the Galapagos Islands. He barely kept up. But it was during this visit to the islands that Darwin developed many of his ideas that he would put forth in his 1859 book, On the Origin of Species. And this book, as boring as it might be, becomes an international bestseller and changes the way that we will think about life and existence forever. And that's really the effect that Darwin has. It's simply amazing how huge his impact was, and how he observed birds, he observed other animals, and his argument was that, look, these animals have survived throughout time through a process we basically call evolution, where basically the animals who adapt to their environment make adaptations, continue to survive, and those who do not adapt die off. What Darwin did not say was survival of the fittest. That phrase is going to come later. Now, Darwin will eventually adopt it and use it in later editions of his book. But survival of the fittest is actually, and sadly, a phrase that's going to be applied to human society as we keep going forth. And that's what we get to here. His writing, Darwin's writings, and he didn't intend for this to happen, but his writings will eventually be used by political leaders to justify this, silly notion of white superiority. And this is going to become, sadly, a reality for much of the 19th century, all the way up until the Second World War. And basically with industry, science, technology, all these things converging, humans are thinking. They're thinking in different ways. They're trying to understand, why are some rich and so many poor? Why are some weak and others strong? And when Darwin comes out with his theory of evolution, this is going to be grasped onto then by scientists, by anthropologists, people who study societies and history. It's going to be latched onto by authors and philosophers and other thinkers. And basically, they look around the world by the middle of the 19th century to, the 1860s, 1870s, and they say, hey, look, you know what? Europe runs the planet at this time, right? I mean, they're taking over all these places. So the Europeans begin to assume that they must be a superior race, a superior people. And from this, we're going to get the theory called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is not created by Charles Darwin, right? It's just named after him because of the theory of evolution. It's actually created by the guy you see there to the right, a guy named Herbert Spencer, who was a philosopher in Britain. And what Spencer said was, look, human society is all about the survival of the fittest, right? People are wealthy because they have the genetic predisposition, not necessarily talking about genes per se, but they have whatever adaptations, genes will come in later, adaptations that allow them to become wealthy and to be ahead of others. While the poor, well, they haven't adapted. They, in essence, have not evolved. And Herbert Spencer, who becomes, very popular, his writings are going to be read all over Europe and are going to become foundational sadly, to racism and bigotry and discrimination against literally billions of people around the planet. And then other, so-called sciences start to be developed. This guy that you see here, Francis Galton, who was actually a cousin of Darwin, ends up developing this practice that we call eugenics. And eugenics is basically this study of genetic coding, basically, of heredity. And basically what people like Galton and numerous others who will come along as well, what they're going to argue is that the human society should only allow certain humans to procreate. What Galton thought was, and overall what eugenics is, it's the study of human improvement by genetic means, right? So basically what Galton said was that, there should be a system of arranged marriages between men of distinction and women of wealth. And then that would eventually produce a gifted race. I mean, this type of thinking is coming out, in the midst of the, mid to late 19th century. And this stuff is going to have drastic consequences for many human beings well into the 20th century. We'll talk more about this in class. But, that being said, you have a lot of critics of this Industrial Revolution. We already saw the Luddites who, take a more physical approach, smashing the machines. But you had a lot of authors during this time who wrote quite a bit about the struggles of the average person in this Industrial Revolution. Some of the great writers, a couple of them you've certainly heard of, Charles Dickens, who, of course, writes the very famous Christmas Carol about Scrooge. Not Scrooge McDuck. I used to watch that cartoon. I guess he's kind of after him, though. I don't know if Scrooge had a money bin. But nonetheless, Charles Dickens wrote many books, too, that really talked about hard times. Well, literally, that was the name of one of the books, Hard Times, that really talked about, the struggles of the average person during this Industrial Revolution, struggles of the average worker. Charlotte Bronte, she writes a book called Shirley. And in this book, she's talking about the Luddites and their struggles in Yorkshire in Great Britain in the textile industry. And interestingly, too, with that book, Shirley, the name became more popular for girls because in Bronte's book, in her novel, the name was considered solely a male name. It's an Irish name, and Shirley, is what you would have was a typical guy's name, but the father, and who is portrayed in Bronte's book, he ends up having a daughter, but he wanted a boy, so he names her Shirley after a guy, giving her a guy's name. But of course, today Shirley has basically become a female name. A little aside for you there. And some other interesting folk that are going to be coming along during this time. Actually, they've already come out by the 1850s, definitely. A guy named Frederick Engels, who's going to write The Condition of the Working Class in England, talking about Victorian working class in England. But he has an even more famous writing partner, a guy by the name of Karl Marx. And these guys are also discussing the issues that workers are facing in this industrial age, and we'll talk much more in depth on these guys in later PowerCasts. So basically, overall, what you have an economic reordering, right? All aspects of lives are changed. for everyone, whether you're rich or poor, whatever, your life is going to be altered by this. The Industrial Revolution alters, the way people traded, the way countries traded. It changed what people consumed, what they purchased. They're buying manufactured goods now, for example. The Industrial Revolution is going to require new ways of mobilizing capital. We talked about what mobilizing capital means earlier. And obviously the pattern, the rhythm of work routines, right? I mean, no longer is work, controlled by, hey, it's daylight, we work, it's nighttime, we go to sleep, or we don't work. Now it's all about the clock. And eventually, once we start getting more artificial lighting in factories, even nighttime will kind of lose its I guess, escape in a sense, right? Because now you can have lights lighting up the factories and people can work 24/7. And we'll talk more about light as well, and how that was perceived. It's going to change where people work. People are having to, move into cities to work in the factories. So changing, where they work, where they live, family sizes, arrangements. People living in just really small apartments called tenements, with disease and everything else spreading in these cities. And two, it changed the people who were in this Industrial Revolution. It changed how they looked at the people who were not in this Industrial Revolution. The Europeans are going to look at, much of China, many places across Africa, Southeast Asia, places that don't really industrialize, Latin America. And the Europeans are going to say, well, they haven't industrialized, so therefore they must be inferior. Well, no, they're not industrializing because they're not being permitted to by the Europeans. So overall, basically, what we start to see with this Industrial Revolution, families are now producing for a marketplace. No longer is it a family producing for the local village or, even more so producing for themselves. They're producing for stores where people can go and shop. And global trade is suddenly just going to have what we call staple goods, trading of staple goods. Staple goods, in other words, things basically that you use every day, right? Milk and butter, bread, basically things that you need, to get through everyday life. Overall, standards of living actually increase. Now, that may not make sense at first, but if you take everything collectively, even though workers are not making very much money, right, individually, if you take economies as a whole, standards of living have actually increased because now people have access to goods, even if they are poor. People have, more access to places to live. Cities realize that they have to have things like sewers rebuilt, right, to control disease, things like this. Reliable water sources. Later in the century, reliable electricity sources. And the Industrial Revolution overall too. All of a sudden, farmers, they can now produce enough food to feed these huge urban populations. There were many thinkers at the end of the 18th century and early 19th century who said, "Oh no, we're going to run out of food if we keep growing such large populations." No, because of the Industrial Revolution in combination with the Agricultural Revolution, plenty of food. And basically, people begin to devote more time to work and less time to leisure activities. And, even more consequently, even more importantly, people begin to dedicate less time to their faith, to going to church and things like this. So, people are becoming more materialistic in this era. And you're going to see religious leaders, begin to try to shift this back and pull people back, toward where they should be. Toward the Lord. Factory wages, they're too low individually to provide an adequate standard of living. So I know it seems kind of odd here to have standard of living increase, but not an adequate standard of living. But that's what I was saying, is that standard of living overall, if you take everything collectively, increases, right? Standard of living individually is going to be stagnant because wages just aren't high enough. Because overall what you have is a very uneven distribution of wealth. You have a very few with a whole lot of money and a whole lot with very little money. And just talking about some of those goods that we see going around. I mean, by the middle of the 19th century, you've got people drinking tea in cups made in England with leaves grown in China, sugar harvested in the Caribbean by African imported slaves, right? In the 18th or in the 19th century. We have too the Europeans trying to sell products to people by telling them just lies. One very famous one was pear soap that you see here, and a very famous quote there, the white man's burden. We'll talk about that later as well, what that means. But you even have, these European, particularly British companies selling soap to Indians and to Africans, saying that this will whiten your skin to make you closer to white people who are superior. This kind of silliness that is, that comes out of this 19th century. So it's a frightening time, and it's a frightening precedent that is set by the Industrial Revolution and more contact. Poor people are still drinking coffee and tea and consuming sugar, and sometimes they even eat soap. But nonetheless, poor people, the point being here is that it's gross to eat soap, but the bigger point is that people could still afford these staple goods. So even though, the wages are low for a good standard of living, this is a large part why standard of living is still increasing, because even if you're poor, because things are cheaper, you can still buy them. We're going to see merchants become filthy rich, which are going to create these massive commercial cities, lots of trade. New York City is going to become a global city as we roll into the late 19th century. And we're going to see new professionals, accountants, lawyers. You need people who can help other people who are engaged in these complex trades and companies that have emerged. So basically, people who trade goods, merchants, financiers, bankers, they're going to rise to the top of the social ladder economically. So basically, the Industrial Revolution in Europe, Europe becomes more powerful because it's going to export more than imports. It's going to monopolize trade, even though, of course, they say that they are capitalists, free markets. No, they're going to monopolize it. They're going to use colonies, former colonies, for resources, and use those raw materials to make products in European factories and then sell them back to the people from whom they basically took the raw materials. We're going to see regions like Latin America become financially dependent upon Europe. We'll talk more about that. Europe is going to maintain control over industrial technology. They don't want this technology to get out. And because of European power, they can basically initiate embargoes. In other words, refusing to trade and not allowing other countries to trade, controlling the global economy. And finally, the impact of this revolution, workers, they're not really going to receive much relief. The fact of the matter is that, the British Parliament, in Britain particularly, obviously, the British Parliament is more interested in profit than really, helping the average person. Now, there are going to be some acts passed by the Parliament to give men the right to vote, and they're going to expand the franchise, in other words, the right to vote, suffrage, to even the poor. But it's still only men who are voting, and on top of that, voting isn't necessarily going to make you more money per hour. I guess it could, but it's kind of a long course to take. And basically, if you were poor in Britain, you would have to join a workhouse, which was this kind of place, kind of an unemployment place, basically. And that was the only way you could receive any semblance of relief from the British government. In a lot of places, we still had lack of running water, no garbage pickup, underground sewers, missing in some of these places where we see widespread disease. Now, of course, these things are going to be fixed as we move into the late 19th century. And factory workers, they're working, sun up to sundown or longer. But of course, they're not even getting to rely upon the sun anymore. Their time is being controlled by the factory owner and artificially a clock. And we see a lot of many unemployed leave their homes and they migrate around the world. The 19th century is an era of great migration, the greatest century for migration, where we have people from all over the world moving to other places all over the world. And many of them are moving to the United States. They're moving to Canada. They're moving to Australia, the outback, right? And finally, you know, workers barely earned enough to scrape by daily. Pretty uplifting stuff here, but we'll keep talking about the Industrial Revolution and life during the Industrial Revolution as we keep moving along and the beat goes on. Da-da-dum, da-da-dum. Thanks for tuning in.